All right. And welcome back, you guys, to the Self-Selecting Podcast. I am your host, Corey Hageman. Thank you for being here. Thank you for tuning in. Real quick, for those of you who are listening from YouTube, big announcement. And at this point, maybe if you are an avid follower, maybe if you are part of the notification gang, if you are getting the push notifications, you already know this. But for those of you who are new to the channel or new to the podcast, bi-weekly, I have guests come on to go into all aspects of fitness, their experience within the, fitness space, competitive space. But I've had a lot of individuals hit me up and be like, hey, can you have so-and-so on? Can you have this person that I also follow that I think would make good conversation? And I figured it is probably wise to ask you guys if there are people that you want to see on here on the Self-Selecting Podcast, if there are people you want me to interview or just have a discussion with. Interview is very formal, and some of the episodes, they turn into that. Others, they become a little more fluid, a little more conversational. And if there is someone that you are interested in having on the show, on this platform, definitely let me know. Put that in the comments. That's something that I feel like at this point, like I haven't really encouraged you guys to do. So just wanted to say that. Also, bi-weekly, I have a new format, which again, if you are tuned into the channel, you probably are already familiar with. These are educational videos. I figured it at this point, like these episodes, they run 60 minutes long typically, and they can be very dense. And I know for me, whenever I get on YouTube, there are times when I'm like, okay, like I'm going to binge this 2.5 hour podcast, typically Flagrant podcast or Fuad's podcast. But there are also times where I'm like, hey, I just want the information. I need something a little more digestible. Maybe the commute to work or for me to the gym is only, 10, 15 minutes. And I don't want to get into something and then lose my place and then forget about it. So that was kind of the idea with the new format, is to give you something that is very, very focused, very to the point, and very actionable, because I feel like a lot of times with these episodes, there's some of you who are very enthusiastic that like, hey, it's great because it is, if it's solo episodes, it's just you kind of combing through, distilling out your ideas. Big fan of it. And then there are others that are like, yeah, but throughout all this, I'm missing those key takeaways. I don't know how to actually apply this information. And that's where I think the new format is going to integrate well and really complement all the information that I'm already covering in these long forms. So if you guys are enjoying that, well, good. I'm glad, because Emily is putting a lot of work into those. I'm putting a lot of work into really the format, into the design of it. But at this point, when is this going to be launched? It's maybe closer to April. You probably have 2 or 3 additional ones kind of in the tank. And if that's something that you're enjoying, if that's something you're like, hey, I like this format because it is a little easier to get through, it's not as dense, and there's a topic that you want to see, drop it in the comments below. Super helpful. The content of this channel is very much oriented around where the gaps are, and strictly from what I hear from you guys. So with all that being said, today we are diving right in to something that I know my clients struggle with. I myself struggle with as well. I would even say currently throughout this fat loss phase, it's something that, I'll wake up and, I'll get kind of hit in the face with it and be like, okay, well, this again, like I've been doing this long enough. I didn't think this was still going to be an issue. And that problem that I know a lot of you still struggle with, no matter how intermediate or advanced you might be, is weight fluctuations. And not just, okay, well, this sucks to see the scale weight go up, but that true concern, that true doubt as to whether or not this is normal, this is due to something you did or didn't do, or this is related to a hormonal fluctuation, a hormonal imbalance, hormonal dysfunction. And let me just paint a picture for those of you who might, who frankly have no idea what I'm talking about. If you woken up, you've been on plan, you've been 100% adherent, you step on the scale first thing in the morning, only to see, like, you go in and kind of with some expectation that like, hey, I'm going to be down because frankly, I didn't eat a lot yesterday. I prescribed to everything that my coach or, I guess my program entails. And you get up and you're like, okay, cool. Like I'm going to see a new low and this is going to get my day started. But you're not met with that dopamine response. On the contrary, you're actually met with the opposite. You see the scale weight and it is up to 3, maybe even 4 pounds. And you start to feel like shit. You start to feel annoyed and you're like, oh, okay, well, in the case you're working with a coach, maybe you're like, shit, should I text my coach? Should I send them an email? Like my weight's up 3 pounds and I was on plan. Like what could be causing this? And you start to play back yesterday and you start to think, okay, was I actually on plan? Was there anything that could have snuck in? Was there anything that I didn't track? Did I not work out as hard? Did I not get through all the cardio? Am I going crazy right now? And really this emotional roller coaster, because for most people when this happens, my clients especially, they'll reach out midweek and they'll be like, hey, nothing's wrong. I didn't go off track, but I'm kind of freaking out because I see that scale weight is up. It's up 2 pounds and I've been on plan. So I don't know, do we need to change something? Is your math wrong? Do I need to drop food today, immediately? And more often than not, a few days later, if not the following day, the weight drops. And it's like nothing happened. And it feels kind of, like you're being held hostage by the scale. I think for a lot of people, that's what I would describe it as, or that's how I've had them describe it to me. And it kind of leaves you wondering, is this normal? Does everyone go through this? And in the scope of following, a very regimented protocol, I can say that there are absolutely instances where it's not normal. There are instances where it is due to some kind of imbalance or dysfunction hormonally, and the client did benefit from knowing that and then addressing it, taking the proper intervention. So in this video today, what we're going to do, I'm going to walk you through really hopefully a step-by-step guide and tell you exactly how to differentiate between a weight fluctuation that is normal, that's expected, and a hormonal imbalance that inadvertently is leading to slowed fat loss, impeded progress. And hopefully through watching this information, you can then, gather that autonomy so that you know what to look for and kind of the audit to go through if this does happen to you. And I think by the end of it, hopefully, if this is something you're currently going through, or if it's something that recently you've experienced and you're just like, is it gonna be this way forever? Hopefully you have some clarity and at least a solid plan. So with that being said, let's get started. So I think first, clarifying exactly what weight fluctuations actually are. I think having that understanding will eliminate 90% of these panic moments first thing in the morning. Now, weight fluctuations, they are small, incremental, transient ups and downs, changes in your scale weight. Now, typically I would say the range I see is 1 to 4 pounds, but I mean, you can even see fluctuations half a pound. So don't take these ranges, set in stone. And this can be on a daily basis. This could be on a weekly basis. And they don't actually represent body fat changes, but rather these temporary shifts either due to fluid balance, digestion, food volume, inflammation. Now, these are the aspects that we're going to cover today. Now, I want you to think of these as your body's temporary responses to what's happening in your life. Now, in the case of weight fluctuations, these are completely normal. They are common. And I can tell you, it's more atypical to have someone who doesn't see fluctuations, even to the extent a 1 pound fluctuation, a 1 pound difference in someone's high versus low is very weird. That to me is actually more representative of someone who is experiencing slower GI transit, excessive inflammation, chronic stress. I usually see very subtle shifts in someone's high and low, typically before or the week of their period. So before we get into hormonal imbalances, hormonal dysfunction, which we're going to, I promise, I want to really dive into and give a deep understanding to why these fluctuations happen. So I want to start with really the most common factor, which is going to be food choices, specifically calories, but we can also look at food volume. And when we really get into the weeds of like macronutrients, micronutrients, electrolytes, minerals, sodium intake. Sodium is crucial, and it's not something that you should eliminate or heavily restrict. That's not needed in order to lose body fat. But it does help our body maintain fluid balance. And when we eat higher amounts of when we eat higher amounts of sodium, our body's going to naturally hold on to extra water temporarily. Now, if you can think back to the last time that you had soup, any kind of noodle dish, honestly, really any kind of takeout, because takeout, I mean, like, they want to sell good food, and like sodium is going to make food taste better. If you go out to eat to restaurants, I mean, even if you're having still a very clean meal, and I say clean, I just mean like very whole food dense. When you're looking at these meals, like, it's very likely that these dishes have higher degrees of sodium. And I think oftentimes people will get lost into this trap where they'll be like, well, I'm just not going to go out to eat. I'm going to make all of the foods that I desire, that I'm craving at home. That way I can control sodium intake, which I think is smart. Like, I think that's one way to do it. But where this can sneak up on you is when you make certain dishes. So when you use different seasonings on your protein, so like taco seasoning, or like we've been doing like a Mediterranean seasoning, like a shawarma seasoning, and you use it not realizing that like there are like 2 to 3 grams of sodium in these little packets. Another big one that I see, especially when people get sick, is they'll make at-home soup. I don't know why I said it like that. I guess English is slowly coming to me this morning. I'll make soup at home, and they'll be like, okay, well, it's low sodium. It's 30% less than like, a standard can or, standard box, whatever it is. And they're not really paying attention to the fact that still, if they are to consume this is 5-6x the amount of sodium that they would have in their normal meal. So is it something that you need to be like really strict about tracking sodium with? I mean, it depends. Like, someone who is very sensitive to scale fluctuations, and if, we kind of know that like it could be related to sodium, I think a lot of people find peace of mind by understanding where these fluctuations come from. And when we can like just, pull the trees back, pull the branches back, I don't know. When we can pull the branches back and really just make sense of like, okay, like this is happening. There's a strong correlation when you eat high sodium, and this could be in the case of eating a meal at home that you make. We tend to see scale weight go up 1 to 2 pounds the next day, even if calories are controlled. So then we have to look at total calories. And this isn't going to be a podcast on adherence because I have like a dozen of those already, but I'll just say that if you're not being accurate with your tracking, if food reporting is not high, or you're guesstimating, or even if you're going out, you're getting kava, you're getting Chipotle, you're getting Sweetgreen, like, you have to understand there's going to be some discrepancy in the food that you eat. And I wouldn't necessarily think of it, especially in the case where like you are not like a competitor or you are not strictly dieting. It doesn't mean that you're doing something wrong by making a swap substitution and still tracking it, but you have to know that it is a little bit of a gamble. There's a dice roll that accompanies eating out. So if you're not seeing the progress that you're wanting to see, and you're having a lot of meals out, or a lot of meals that are guesstimated, maybe, your partner, they're also prepping food and they're not being super strict with like the oil they're using or the amounts that they're tracking. It's just something to pay attention to. Now, that aside, outside of like global caloric intake, we really have to consider macronutrient breakdown. And this is something that I just had a conversation with a new client, because she realized that she was actually mistracking her carbs. She was tracking net carbs, and what I wanted her to do, and what I want all my clients to do, is track total carbs. Now, when she made the switch, she was tracking her net carbs, and then she went down to total carbs. So inadvertently, there was a decrease in her carb intake. What she saw is that scale weight went down pretty much overnight, because it was a pretty big change in carb intake at that point. Now, we agreed that she was going to do a high day, which we were going to go back to the previous carb intake, which I think it was like 70 more grams of carbs. Now, she came to me the next day because we had our weekly call. So for some clients, I actually get on the phone with them or a Zoom call. And it's just like for added accountability. It is something that I offer with my coaching. And we get on our call and she's like, I'm really bummed because what I'm seeing is that now my weight is higher. And I was really hoping that this high day wouldn't make me gain fat. And I believe it did. And I was like, whoa, hold on. Like, we have to look at like total calories. Like, yes, they were higher, but were they high enough to actually cause fat gain? And that's where I kind of posed it to her. I'm like, we really have to consider what was the macronutrient split prior to, and what was it the day that was her high day. I was like, look at the carb intake. So when we consider like every gram of carb, you are going to store 3 to 4 grams of water. You're going to actually increase like overall volume in your body. And this can manifest on the scale as a 1 to 2, a 3 pound increase if we're talking about big swings. And this was something that she kind of posed to me early on, in our coaching. She's like, should I be calorie cycling? Should I have days that are a little bit lower? Or should I just have constant calories? And the question I asked her was like, well, does it bother you when you see these fluctuations in the scale weight? Because if it does, I'm going to recommend that even if we do calorie cycle, we don't do great variations in the carb intake, because that will absolutely manifest in addition to other lifestyle factors that can drive weight fluctuations. And last point I want to make around food intake is foods that contain higher fiber amounts, or even just like high volume foods. So I've had it happen where clients have come to me, they've done complete overhauls with their diets. They've gone from eating like very calorically dense foods, but then we go into a fat loss phase and they're like, okay, like I'm really worried about satiety around hunger. I'm going to have a ton of veggies, and overnight their fiber intake goes from maybe 20 to 30 grams to 60 to 70, and they actually find that this now causes them to have less frequent bowel movements. They're also just like holding more lower abdomen bloat. And this isn't bloat in the sense of like an inflammatory reaction. It truly is just GI weight. So key takeaways from the food domain of weight fluctuations is you have to consider if you're eating out, was there a discrepancy in actual calories? Was there a discrepancy in sodium? If you made the food yourself, same thing. Did you mistrack accidentally, unintentionally? It doesn't mean like you did it deviantly. It just means like, was there an opportunity for more calories to kind of find their way into your food? Are you calorie cycling? Is there a giant shift in macronutrient profile? Or did you make this like vast switch in your food selection, now causing your fiber intake to go up overnight? If it's any of these, I wouldn't panic. And I would say like a way that we can like test this is revert back to what you did prior to and see if the scale weight goes down. Don't panic. It is temporary. It's usually water weight. And a good rule of thumb, and I guess I probably should have said this at the beginning, is like if scale weight comes on rapidly, typically isn't fat gain. If it comes off rapidly, definitely not fat gain. That's like a double confirmation. Water weight, on the other hand, doesn't hang around for 6 weeks. If it's sticking, probably not water. That is, unless it is a hormonal imbalance, which we will get into later. So, section 2, activity levels and training stimulus. Now, you can probably think back to whenever you started a new training program or significantly increased the volume, or frankly, just did a new exercise that was really taxing. You probably woke up the next day and you were sore. And you have to understand that when you train intensely, like really hard, particularly resistance training, so weightlifting, your muscles experience micro tears. And this is one of the ways that they grow stronger. But along with this damage, along with this adaptation, comes inflammation. Now, I can tell you when I've done check-ins, I've had to be very diligent with noting, were these check-ins specifically after a very intense leg day, or were they after an upper day? Now, the reason is, in my build, what I actually found is that the days that I would check in directly after a really hard leg day, my glutes would be up. Glutes would be much bigger, much fuller. And granted, some of this, yes, could very well be water, but I would also see my waist was up. I would also see that my legs were up, and my legs are not necessarily an area that I'm training directly. I'm not training in isolation. I'm not trying to grow big quads or hamstrings. So seeing that overall, after I had a really intense leg session or lower session, seeing how this presented in my physique the next day, I could almost guarantee that if I did my check-ins and specifically my measurements, my calipers, that those reads would be different. Whereas if I checked in on a day after I trained upper body, or I did just cardio, or even after a rest day, all of the measurements collectively, including my glutes, would be down. Now, what I'll say is that if you're very sensitive to, let's say you're dissatisfied that you're not seeing your measurements go up and you're like, yo, like I'm training my ass off, I'm having really hard sessions, it could be worth comparing and really taking a look at like when you're checking in relative to what body part you're training and if there's continuity there or if you could be more consistent on that front. Now, on the flip side, suddenly decreasing your activity can definitely result in a degree of a fluctuation. And for some people, this is favorable. For some people, they're like, okay, my weight's lower the next day after a rest day because I recovered really well and I dropped off that inflammation. Amazing. For some, they find that those rest days due to the decreased total activity is actually pretty frustrating and upsetting. And you really have to understand that in the case that you are holding on to fluid, hydrating and getting enough sleep is going to be your best friend in terms of diuresing, so dropping off that held, retained fluid. Now let's talk about the obvious one, stress and poor sleep. Sleep is one of the two things that your body can utilize in terms of recovery, the other one being food. Now, in the case that you are under-rested, underslept, or you got sleep but just wasn't very high quality, this is typically when we see hunger spike because your body is gravitating towards that other form of recovery. So what I typically say is like, if you're not being consistent with your sleep hygiene, if you don't have a regimen that allows you to get an adequate 7 to 8 hours of sleep, this is definitely an area for improvement. It's something that will like objectively improve the results you're getting. And if we're specifically talking about weight fluctuations, it's oftentimes the culprit behind these really gnarly spikes that are 3-4 pounds. And one thing I want to note about stress, because I know a lot of you listening to this, I know you have things in your life that you can't really modify. You are either in relationships, you have responsibilities to your family unit, you have careers, you're in school, you have a lot on your plate. And I respect that. I think it's great that you're working hard and working to achieve your dreams. Now, within that, even if all you can do is manage your stress better, I would still say that's an area for improvement. And I'll tell you stories. So I had a client who right now she's married, no kids, but in school to get her master's degree. We're following a pretty hefty, I would say, fat loss program. And one of the things that we're working on is how she manages her stress, because frankly, it's like she can't get rid of any of those primary stressors. It's just temporary. It's something that she kind of has to manage at this point. And what I recommend for her, I'm like, so as you're going through and you're segmenting all these times within your week that you have these school responsibilities, you have these training responsibilities, you have marital responsibilities, you have work responsibilities. Okay, there needs to be time that you deliberately segment out, time to decompress and get organized with what is stressing you out. And some of those things may be actionable. Some of those you may be able to modify, others not so much. But realistically, there is no award for overextending yourself. And I find that a lot of people, they tend to try to get the most out of both their body and their mind without really considering how is this allowing them to show up in all of these domains in life. And this is not a stress management podcast. I'll save that topic for an exclusive episode on its own. But what I'll say is that once you can start to take care of yourself, there's a strong correlation with showing up in all aspects of life better. And if you're really focused on getting the most out of your body and your mind, I think this is something that we need to stop neglecting and stop setting so low on the totem pole and really figuring out what are ways that we can manage the stress that we have better rather than just eliminate them entirely. Weigh-ins and meal timing, that's the next section. So another underrated and very impactful aspect that can show up on the scale weight is whether or not you're weighing in roughly at the same time every day and whether or not you're having your last meal of the day at the same time. Now, I'm not telling you to follow this like super strict regimented program that like requires you to eat at 8 p.m. on the dot and 8:30 is considered a fail. But our bodies do follow a circadian rhythm, and it's really something that I see pretty common, where individuals will get on the scale at 7 and then the next day they'll get on the scale at 5 and they'll be a little confused. They'll be like, why am I up 2.5, 3 pounds? I'm like, those are 2 extra hours likely of sleep that you didn't get. And assuming that you didn't make that up the night before by going to bed 2 hours earlier, now you're under recovered. Now, the other side to this is if you usually finish dinner around 6 p.m., but last night you ate a little bit later, maybe you had to go to the store to get food to eat that night, so you started your meal prep later, and then like by the time you actually got around to eating, it was closer to 9:30, 10. Your body still might be digesting that food. And when you weigh in the next morning, you're literally weighing the foods and fluids that you haven't processed. Now, again, is this something that you need to get really neurotic about? No. And that's kind of the theme with all of these factors that can affect scale weight. It's that if you understand that these could be causing it, this should hopefully alleviate some of the stress that comes with seeing that fluctuation. And in the future, if it bothers you that much, you can then take action to modify some of these factors that are driving these fluctuations. Now, another factor that plays a significant role is going to be hydration and digestion. Now, it's subtle, but you have to understand that if you're dehydrated, your body is actually going to hold on to extra fluid to compensate. One of the first things that I learned when I started getting into bodybuilding and educating myself on fitness and nutrition was the role that hydration played. Now, I'm notoriously very bad about keeping up water intake. It's not something that comes natural to me, and it's something I have to like really think about and make myself do on a regular basis. Now, this was something that I didn't really consider, and I didn't understand the role that being underhydrated, dehydrated played in driving scale fluctuations through fluid retention. And that's the thing, is like I have all my clients track their fluid intake, and this includes all non-caffeinated beverages because frankly, I want that kind of accountability. So really what you have to understand is that if you're dehydrated, your body's going to hold on to extra fluid as compensation. And the best diuretic, the most immediate diuretic, is going to be drinking fluid. A perpetuating cycle that I see. Someone will be dehydrated. They won't hydrate effectively. The next day, what happens? Regardless of what scale weight reads, maybe they're the same, maybe they're a little bit heavier, they won't be able to use the bathroom. This then leads them to feel bloated, leads them to feel full, specifically in the lower abdomen. What does that do? That tends to discourage people from wanting to hydrate. I see this time and time again. And the thing is, like, dehydration doesn't just manifest on the scale weight or in your transit time. It also affects your training performance. And you're going to find that this is one of the easiest ways to ensure that you are prepared and able to go into your sessions and perform the way you want to. Now, lastly, let's dive into inflammation, which I kind of already talked about in terms of training-driven inflammation and stress-driven inflammation. But for women on a monthly cycle, for most women, or most women who have relatively a regular cycle, these hormonal fluctuations are huge, huge factors. And hormones like estrogen, progesterone, they fluctuate very regularly throughout this cycle. And these can cause substantial fluid retention. And for most people, most clients I have, they typically see at least 1 week, maybe even just a few days, up to 2 weeks can create these very muddied weigh-ins, muddied check-ins, muddied measurements because they're carrying that extra fluid. And I think it's something that for me, I always struggled with accepting that, 10 days, 7 to 10 days out of the month, I'm not going to feel my tightest, or I'm not going to feel my leanest despite being 100% on track. And realistically, it wasn't until I started logging when I was experiencing these, I would say like PMS driven, like fluid retentive states, which that's a very made up phrase. It wasn't until I started logging these things that I was at least able to make peace with it, because I'm like, okay, this happens pretty much the same time the later half of my cycle. And what do you know? When I get my period, it goes away too. Now, for some people, that fluctuation, that fluid retention happens the week of their period. For others, it happens the week before. But I think getting very familiar with when you specifically see these signs of PMS or these altered body states on account of hormonal fluctuations, I think that can be really reassuring because frankly, you get up, you see the scale weights up even though you were 100% on track, and yep, like clockwork, this happened last month and it happened the month before that, and it's going to happen the next month. And I think really the key for most people, most women who experience these kind of fluctuations, is understanding that it is out of their control. The best way to diurese, to get rid of fluid retention, which you're probably not going to be able to do to the fullest extent, is through drinking fluid, getting enough rest, and being very gentle and kind to your body, which for some people might make them think, okay, well, we need to take time off working out. We need to scale back on intense training. I actually find the opposite to be effective, at least in my case. During those periods of feeling a little more inflamed and a little more, estrogen dominant, I tend to feel better when I'm exerting myself and making myself sweat and, doing some semblance of something that is hopefully going to create endorphins. Whereas the times where I've skipped training or, I've scaled back my volume tremendously, I haven't felt my best because realistically, I'm like, I'm not going to be as strong and I'm not going to feel my best, but I still have the function that I had last week. So realistically, I should still be able to perform. And even if I can't lift the same weights, I should be able to go in and I'll probably feel better by just getting some movement that day. Okay, so at this point, we've established that daily fluctuations, completely normal. They typically are very temporary. It's very abnormal for people to not see vast changes from a low weight versus a high weight in a 7-day period. This is why I'm a big fan of taking 7 weigh-ins per week, specifically for people who have kind of a fixation or have a weird kind of emotional tie to scale weight in those changes. I think this normalizes those fluctuations, and being that person myself, I can tell you that once I got comfortable at taking scale weight, even when I knew I was inflamed or knew I was retaining fluid or didn't use the bathroom, I still found that I was able to see it's up 2 pounds. Okay, what are we going to do about it? Am I going to let this ruin my day? Or am I just going to continue on as is because I have faith in the program? I have faith in what I'm doing. So we know that these kind of fluctuations, they do happen to everyone, and they don't actually represent fat gain because realistically, for you to gain a pound of fat in a day, that means you would have to eat 3,500 calories over your maintenance. And if you were truly eating in a deficit and you are reporting your food at even a moderately high rate, you would be very, very hard pressed to miss overeating 3,500 calories above a maintenance. So how do we know when something deeper is going on? So it's important to clarify this clearly because hormones often get blamed prematurely when the real issues might simply be any of the lifestyle factors we've already covered. But with that being said, there absolutely are situations where hormones truly do impede progress, causing frustration, causing exhaustion, and a sense that your body is working against you. So first things first, and this is a phrase that I've coined several years ago, is you can't manage what you can't measure. So in the case that someone is uncertain whether or not they're experiencing hormonal fluctuations, the first thing I want to look at is what they are tracking and what they're not tracking. And this includes lab work. Now, I said this before, your weight, it might spike up temporarily because of a salty meal, a stressful week, because of your period, because you started a new training program. But within a few days, your weight will normalize. And we should typically see that with an artificial inflation, which is really the term that we can coin or we can assign to anything that is very temporary. When you zoom out and look at those weekly averages or the changes in the range, so the high to low, you'll still see clear progress. So you guys know I've talked about the ins and outs of contest prep, what it takes, what it feels like to get shredded. And realistically, if that's what you're signing up for, that dysregulation, that hormonal imbalance that you're agreeing to, you're expecting, that could be warranted given the state that you're in or given the state or guess the goal that you're pursuing. But in the case where you're just trying to lose a little bit of fat, you're just trying to feel better about your body, you're just trying to make some progress, but not to the same extent a professional athlete would or a fitness competitor would, we do want to pay attention to these symptoms and specifically how you're feeling. So consistent fatigue, low energy, constantly feeling tired, drained, struggling to recover, even when nutrition and sleep are dialed in. So this goes back to managing it. And if you can only manage this if you're measuring it. So if you're not tracking your sleep, if you're not tracking your water, these are low-hanging fruit that you don't have to have this meticulous, like super spreadsheet that you log in. I mean, if you work with me, I'll definitely make that for you. But it is something that if you pay attention to, you can begin to determine whether or not this is expected given your current lifestyle. And if you've already made corrections in order to improve sleep and improve nutrition, and you're still feeling that consistent fatigue, that low energy, this could be linked to an issue hormonally, specifically perhaps your cortisol levels, perhaps your thyroid. But this is where we get into the specific lab work that we need to actually confirm said imbalance. Now, this is going to be one that resonates with a lot of you, and it's important to understand the difference between persistent bloating and true GI distension and puffiness, and simply being in a body fat that you're uncomfortable with. And I'll speak from my perspective. Like, I can tell you, being at my highest body fat in 24, I was 152 pounds, and the body fat I was at, I mean, it was very different than the one that I was used to sitting at. And oftentimes this made it very challenging to feel comfortable in my physique, especially given like I was starting to see body fat come on my waist, on my lower back. And this is something that, not being used to it, and frankly not being used to eating the food that I was eating during my builds, became very frustrating, because as much as I wanted it to go away, I kind of realized and accepted that this is just a consequence of it being at a body fat that's not my favorite. And realistically, I can tell you that working with thousands of people now, this is more common, where someone will feel bloated, they'll feel puffy, they'll feel like their lower abdomen is distended immediately after they start drinking water, after they start eating. And this is something that I can tell you, in the terminology of like bloat, distension, these phrases are often overused, and they're often describing a state of discomfort or, a lack of acceptance of a body fat, whereas there actually are individuals who are bloated, who have GI distress. And once they eat, once they begin drinking, they find that they very much feel this pain, and it's very uncomfortable, and it's not something they can necessarily ignore. So really, when it comes down to it, I think understanding the difference between whether or not this is period, PMS bloat, whether this is true, like I ate something bad and I feel like I'm going to be sick, or I have trapped gas, I ate something that didn't agree with me, or hey, this is chronic. Like, I'm waking up with a very round, distended stomach that I can't actually like pull in. And despite sleeping, despite drinking fluid, despite lowering stress, even on my best days where I execute and I'm eating a very simple, easy to digest diet, I'm still experiencing these bouts of bloat and distension. Yeah, absolutely. That's something that we need to pay closer attention to. And I would definitely say could be hormonally driven. So really what I want to say is that, like, in the case where we're talking about symptoms that are subjective, what I would ask yourself is, how bad are these on a scale of 1 to 10? Does anything make them worse? Does anything make them better? Do they persist even despite lowering stress and getting better sleep? Is this something that started at a point that you made some kind of dietary change, that you started a new medication? And this could include a hormonal medication such as hormonal birth control or a hormonal IUD. Okay, continuing on. Irregular menstrual cycles or heavy PMS. Now, I know a lot of people, they will normalize these states of dysfunction, and they'll come to me and they'll be like, hey, I didn't think that anything was wrong because this is how my periods presented for the last 2 decades. And what you have to understand is that missing periods, not a good thing. The epitome of female health is ovulation. Now, whether you want to have kids or not, if we're talking from a standpoint of efficiency, if your body is like essentially overriding and causing you to miss periods, it is deciding that the state that you're in is not able to handle non-critical function. So this should be a primary red flag. And if you have hormonal birth control in place, this is a medication that is going to theoretically and in actuality, it can cause you to miss these periods. So we really have to weigh the pros and the cons when we consider whether or not we're using hormonal birth control for the essence of we're trying to create regularity in the periods. And if by regularity, what we're actually creating is an absence of a period, that's not a great solution, especially when we're considering the side effects that come with synthetic forms of these hormones. So another subjective marker is going to be hair loss, hair thinning, or brittle nails. And if you've listened to my other podcast, you probably know that first and foremost, I'm going to say do a little bit of an assessment as to whether or not lifestyle factors and interventions that you have control of, if they are leading to hair loss or hair thinning. So in the case that you're wearing extensions and you're putting them right here and it's creating a lot of tension on your head the entire day, and as you're brushing, you're being very aggressive with your hair and you're not being very careful there, I promise you, you don't even have to be in your 30s, in your 40s to begin to see that hair thinning or that hair loss. If you get acrylic nails and you get them off and you've been getting them for several months and you find that as you get them off, hey, maybe they're a little weaker, maybe they're a little more brittle. This isn't abnormal. Now, in terms of hair shedding, you also have to consider it's if you're going multiple days without washing your hair, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but you go into the shower, you start to comb through your hair and you have a lot of that shedding still in your hair. That can be really scary, and that can be something oftentimes people assume is actual hair loss. Now, hair loss, thinning, brittle nails, without external factors playing a significant role here. These are symptoms that do often correlate with thyroid issues or chronic cortisol elevation, as well as a highlighting deeper metabolic stress. So assuming that you're not doing any of these catalysts, or you yourself, are being very careful with your hair and your nails, if it's something that's manifesting out of nowhere or it's always been persistent, it could be worth getting a panel done and looking into potential imbalances hormonally. And this kind of goes in line with skin, hair, and temperature changes. But if you're experiencing cold intolerance, heat intolerance, if you're noticing dry skin, this could be a signal that you're experiencing some form of hypothyroidism, or in the case of heat intolerance, potentially menopause. Another subjective marker that we don't want to ignore are extreme mood swings and increased anxiety. So yes, fluctuations in mood, temperament, and I would say stress management, those are generally expected. But we have to really zoom into this chronic feeling of overwhelm, anxiety, emotional volatility or irritability beyond what you're used to. And I would say in these cases, it absolutely is worth getting a panel done, because there can be real imbalances. And it's not just a deficiency or insufficiency of a specific hormone. It's the ratio of specific hormones relative to the values of others that we have to look at. So if this resonates with you, if you feel hey, there could be things on the weight fluctuation side, but some of the symptoms of hormonal imbalances really resonate with you, I want you to grab a piece of paper and I guess really your notes app, and let's just walk through a little bit of a checklist. And I want you to ask yourself honestly and check off which ones apply to you. Has my weight remained stuck or slowly increased despite absolutely being in a deficit, despite consistently dieting and training? Do I regularly feel exhausted even after a full night's sleep? And to what degree? Do I consistently wake up with painful or really significant bloating, puffiness, GI distension, regardless of food choices? Are my menstrual cycles regular? Are they hit or miss? Are they excessively painful? Are they usually heavy? And even outside of my menstrual cycles or premenstrual, do I struggle with significant mood swings, anxiety, or feelings of overwhelm? Is my sleep persistently disrupted, difficult, or non-restorative? Have I experienced noticeable hair thinning, brittle nails, dry skin, rashes, or cold intolerance? If you answered yes to any of these points, especially alongside stalled progress, it could be an indication of a hormonal imbalance. And I do think having clarity around this, and at least having the lab work to confirm that things are where they're supposed to be or close to that, I think that can offer a lot of reassurance for many of you. So what I would do is if you're not already tracking your program, your diet, your training, your sleep, your recovery, I would begin by keeping a very modest log of how you're feeling when things are abnormal, when you're seeing that scale weight go up. I would also consider getting the following labs, and these are ones that you should realistically be able to ask your general provider to write for. And in the case that they're a little stubborn, or you feel a little uncomfortable, or they dismiss you, it could be just a matter of asking them, well, is there a reason that we can't write for them? Is there a reason that you wouldn't want to know more information? I've had a lot of people come to me who have worked with GPs, have worked with private providers, and they have largely been dismissed depending on where you're at in life. I would be very insistent that you want to get the following labs checked. So I would get a CBC, I would get a CMP, I would get a lipid panel. I would also get the following hormones checked: your testosterone, your free test, an SHBG, a DHEA, pregnenolone, estradiol, progesterone, TSH, free T4, free T3. I would also get cortisol looked at. I would also get an A1C. I would get fasting glucose, fasting insulin, as well as FSH, LH. And what's important about timing these labs is that you are getting them checked roughly 7 to 10 days before your period. So realistically, we want to get these labs timed at a point where we can see specific rises and falls of different hormones. And this will be a key indicator in determining whether or not you're having an ovulatory cycle. And for individuals who are not regular, who haven't been regular for a long time, or have no period to begin with, this can be something that I get is frustrating. But if you can delineate any kind of semblance of PMS symptoms that you experience throughout the month that you can infer as ovulation, or essentially the time in which you would experience those pre-period symptoms, I would say trying to time those as closely to that point could be a starting point. But realistically, you might just have to go in blind and get that baseline report and then make decisions on what to do next from there. Listen, there's a lot of people who will tell you to get your hormones checked, and they will use the term hormones very abstractly. Take the list that I gave you, and if you're interested in going through each and every one of these and getting a comprehensive input on what could be going on, what could be affecting your progress, this is something that I do with clients. I will go through your labs with you. We can get on a 45 to 60-minute call. We'll review everything, and I'll give you my best input for where you're currently at. Listen, recognizing these patterns can be really powerful, and it's the first step towards regaining control over your body and honestly finally seeing that progress that you're already working for. And to summarize, these normal fluctuations, they're short-term, they're explainable. Hormonal imbalances, they're persistent, they're unexplained, accompanied by specific symptoms. And if you're concerned and you have been consistent in your programming, then it would be wise to seek expert guidance and get lab work done. Now, guys, I have a lot of videos on thyroid function, on hunger signaling, on hormonal imbalances. So if you are a subscriber to the channel and you haven't seen those, go back through the playlist, take a look at previous episodes that I've done. As always, thank you guys for watching, and I will see you in the next one.